Okay, right. A Ride Across Palestine. There was a short-lived 1970s Western series called Alias Smith and Jones, which might be an appropriate subtitle for this extraordinary little story. Briefly, Mr. Jones, we're told, finds that circumstances took him to the Holy Land. He does not say why, and actually we never completely discover that. And he is approached by Mr. Smith, eager to accompany him on his journey. And I find it interesting that in itself, that having looked over the last few months at various names that Trollope uses, what are we to make of his use here of Smith and Jones? What's going on there? As the journey begins, there are all manner of clues about Smith's identity. He is described, interestingly for Trollope, a significant physical description. In appearance, the gentleman certainly was a gentleman, for I thought that I had never seen a young man whose looks were more in his favour, or whose face and gait and outward bearing seemed to betoken better breeding. He might be some 20 or 21 years of age, was slight and well made, with very black hair, which he wore rather long, very dark, long, bright eyes, a straight nose and teeth that were perfectly white. It's fascinating to get the amount of the short story, a physical description of Mr. Smith. All manner of clues begin to emerge about Smith's identity. Jones is drawn to him in an undefined way. Jones is concerned that Smith has the wrong sort of saddle and offers to rub brandy into the chafed skin from his saddle, an offer that Smith declines. And Smith declines to change to swim in the River Jordan. Jones, when asked, denies that he is married, which is not the case. He simply says that he found himself saying that he wasn't married. Again, we are never told why or what his deceit at that point is actually about. The sense of travel in Palestine is important, at least to Jones. It was a place which led on to some special thoughts. Smith is not impressed. Why seek such spots as these if they only dispel the associations and venerations of one's childhood? Albeit that this discussion happens with Jones having settled down, resting his head on Smith's legs. Smith becomes rather maudlin and tearful. Jones seeks to sympathise and finds of Smith that his hand was soft and cool, almost as a woman's. There was a certainly womanly softness about this fellow. But then again, Jones has a very particular view of women. A woman cries for everything and for nothing. It is the sharpest arrow she has in her quiver. Jones in particular, as we've seen in the previous story, has a very dim view of the local people. They are lazy, they are deceptive, they are disinterested, they are rude. This is part of that hint, I think, about what we might find unacceptable today. They are of no interest, other than they might serve Jones and Smith's interest. As they journey on, they meet other journeying pilgrims. And it is a reminder that journeys to Palestine were not only about exotic travel, but were about the concept of pilgrimage, a journey to a special holy place. As they meet these other journeying pilgrims, Smith quickly conceals himself. Jones meets a very solemn gentleman, and Smith explains later that he wanted to avoid him because this gentleman is in fact his uncle. The encounter with these other pilgrims is all too much for Smith, and he goes to rest. He is little better than a woman, Yet I have become as fond of him as though he were my brother, says Jones. The next stage of the journey is to be by boat, and the boat is delayed. It alarms Smith, who fears that the uncle, still as yet undisclosed to Jones, might catch up. And indeed, a messenger, and then the uncle, William Weston, arrive at where Smith and Jones are lodging. Somewhat out of the blue, Weston charges Jones with eloping with his niece, for he is her guardian. Jones realizes he has been traveling with a woman companion. It all becomes clear to him, or does it, for the first time? How long had he known, or not known? The uncle demands that Jones should marry his niece forthwith, because of course Jones had said that he was not married. And Jones faces his duty to Smith as a woman, to the uncle as a guardian, and to his own unknown family. It leads Jones to confess that he is married and that he has deceived Smith. And he asserts that Smith seemed to him a stranger, not a beautiful woman. The uncle is reluctantly convinced by this and asserts that he and his niece will leave. We never fully discover again why the niece has run away from her uncle and what lies behind her adventure. And they sail to Alexandria, leaving Jones behind. And Jones ends the story in reflective mood. I certainly looked back on that fortnight as the most miserable period of my life. I had been deceived and had failed to discover the deceit, even though the deceiver had perhaps wished that I should do so. For that blindness, I have never forgiven myself. Briefly, 3 or 4 comments. The edition of the story that I got hold of was clearly seeking to sell more copies, because there is a quote on the back. A Ride Across Palestine is a story of deception, guilt, and redemption. Trollope has dealt with the unconventional topic of homoerotic fantasy brilliantly and explicitly. Well, has he or not? Or is that just a hopeful punt by a publisher? It is, as so often a good short story is, a story of wonderful ambiguity. Jones is drawn to Smith with so many clues along the way that Smith is a woman. But who deceives who? Because Jones has asserted that he is not married. Smith has not declared that he is a woman. The uncle has not declared what the issue is between himself and his ward. And even Palestine flatters to deceive, with the contrasting attitudes of Jones and Smith to the place. All this is unexplained and is one of the virtues of a short story. If one was reading a 700-page novel, one would expect the author to have disclosed so much more detail and given so much more information. But it's not a novel, it's a short story, and these things can remain unsaid and unspoken, and we will never know, and we can surmise. Does Jones love Smith, thinking that he is a man and drawn to something about Smith? And does Smith as a woman have strong feelings for Jones, seeing him as a protector and survivor? There are plenty of discussions, plenty of issues to discuss in a few minutes' time, I think, there. I wonder if there's also something touched on in the earlier story too about masculinity and femininity. There would have been about this period very defined views of the adventurous explorer of Victorian England, almost always male. And the adventure would have had a strong element of masculinity about it. Smith, of course, does show many qualities of a woman while dressed as a man, and yet also is capable of making decisions seeking to change the course of her life, even if in the end they end in futility. And she is certainly capable of defending Jones in front of her uncle. And yet, for all her adventure, she still remains controlled by her uncle at the end. She cannot escape her uncle. She cannot escape because of the very way in which the world is organized, and he has dominion and authority over her. It has been a brave attempt. And then something that I guess is a slightly personal view, but I throw this in anyway, which is just something about Palestine. Why Palestine? Well, it was, of course, a place of adventure in the 19th century. It was also a place of pilgrimage. Jones, at least, was after all seeing holy sites. There was a particular journey that was not just about tourism, even if tourism was involved. And in both Jewish and Christian traditions, interestingly, the places that they particularly traveled through, the Dead Sea and the wilderness and the Jordan, in both Jewish and Christian tradition, were places of temptation, places about the forming of identity, and about the place of formation and shaping of character. It is against that background that these stories are set. I'm afraid my reading of Trollope doesn't allow me to know whether that's just an interesting punt or whether there's something in it, but you might like to discuss that as well. Thank you very much.